Regensburg, Bavaria, 8th of May 1945, a grey morning that smells of wet straw and coal smoke. Church bells carry thin over the Danube floodplain while the women's enclosure shivers under a light wind. Lieselotte Lilo Krantz, Wehrmacht-Helferin, clutches the wire when the contraction bites. The metal hums like a tuning fork against her palm. Across the lane, an American military policeman, private first class. Joe Huck Henderson raises 2 fingers to his whistle, a signal his squad uses when routine needs to turn faster. The gatehouse corporal answers with a nod that means ambulance. In the lane, a Dodge WC-54 rolls forward, radiator ticking, Red Cross bright as a promise on a day the Reich has no more promises to give. What Lilo has been told about Americans does not fit the scene. She has been warned to expect jeering, rough hands, withheld food. Instead, the medic's voice is clipped and neutral, the way men speak when they have done the same thing 100 times and intend to do it again tomorrow. A woman appears, Second Lieutenant Ruth Ellison, Army Nurse Corps, gloves already on, cuffs rolled, watching Lilo's breathing like a pilot watches engine gauges. "We're bringing Sie ins Krankenhaus," the interpreter says. "We are taking you to the hospital." Lilo hears the sentence as if through water. Procedure asserts itself the way sunrise does. Henderson logs time, enclosure, prisoner number, destination. His M1 Garand is slung muzzle down, safety on, the 8-round on-block clip a small weight against his palm. The aid tent offers a brief stop. Blood pressure cuff hiss, the cold kiss of a thermometer, the click of a penknife opening sterilized cord clamps. Outside, the ground is rutted into corduroy by trucks. Inside the tent, a field sterilizer ticks, as if counting down to an appointment the war has been trying to miss since September 1939. Ellison would have made the same recommendations anywhere. Contractions too close, presentation uncertain, tent conditions inadequate. Geneva is not a pamphlet here, it is a daily order. Separate quarters for women. Medical attention required by condition. Respect due to their sex. The phrases live on signs and in muscle memory. Lilo's fear has nowhere to stand when faced with this tidy, inexorable machine. The stretcher straps click. The ambulance idles, its inline 6 muttering under the hood, while the radiator fan lifts the canvas flap like a slow breath. Henderson gives the signal. The wire vibrates, then stills. As the WC-54 eases out, the bells roll again over the river, ringing for surrender somewhere beyond the hospital road. Between the clangor and the engine's low growl, Lilo hears a wordless thing. The possibility that the enemy's victory might feel like mercy. The aid tent light is thin as skim milk, but Second Lieutenant Ruth Ellison prefers it to sunshine. Glare hides mistakes. She inventories her kit with a farmer's thrift, 4 rolls of gauze, 2 glass ampules of morphine, 1 rubber tourniquet, a stubby pencil that sharpens with a knife she has carried since Iowa. The blood pressure cuff smells of rubber and soap. She talks through the interpreter with metronome calm. "We're taking you to the hospital. Breathe slow with me. In 2, out 4 Lilo's eyes skate from the red cross on Ellison's sleeve to the enamel tray to the canvas wall, trying to decide which world is real. A junior medic suggests saving the trip. The tent is dry, he argues. The labour is early. Ellison does not look up from the chart. Breach risk is non-trivial. We don't deliver breach in a tent if we have a ward within reach. She has no interest in heroics that end in funerals. She signs the evacuation line, the pencil leaving a groove you could feel in the paper with your eyes closed. Henderson nods through the flap, already checking the ambulance's litter locks, the canvas straps, the spare tyres air, the jack stowed behind the driver's seat, small redundancies that keep seconds from becoming disasters. The driver checks fuel with a stick and calls the level. The radio man scribbles the call sign. Ellison knows doctrine without quoting chapter and verse. The 1929 convention requires what common decency would have required anyway: medical attention according to need, women in separate quarters, regard for their condition. But doctrine is more than comfort. It is a tool for persuasion. Orders support transfer, she tells the medic, and that ends it. She would have said the same thing in Italy or Belgium or the Pacific, because being consistent is how you teach men to trust your judgment. They lift Lilo on the count, up, and the stretcher gives that small, reliable creak all litters make when they take a human weight. The tent flap slaps their shoulders. Outside, a GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck grinds past, stacked with wooden crates, stenciled, dressings, plasma, syringes. The convoy smell is oil, canvas, and hot break, comforting as a bakery to people who live by schedules. Henderson climbs onto the running board, one hand on the roof rail, the Garand's sling snug. The driver calls the gear, and the ambulance noses forward. Ellison checks the watch she pinned to her pocket, then checks Lilo's pupils. Good, she says, as if approval itself were medicine. She would have said more, but the engine note deepens, and the Danube's mist thins into daylight, and the chapter turns by itself, like a page lifted by a careful hand. The ambulance rides like a boat on a choppy lake, the WC-54's suspension answering potholes with a steady, practiced heave. Through the rear windows, the convoy unspools. GMC CCKWs at 3-minute intervals, tailgates clattering, canvas tops snapping under a sullen wind. Regensburg's ruined streets fall away, a church spire like a finger bone, glass glittering in gutters, a horse nosing a ration tin. Henderson checks the mirror and sees what every MP likes to see. Nothing surprising. The radio operator up front tests the set and gets a friendly hiss, the kind that means the Hills will not steal their words today. Inside, Ellison narrates the ride. In 2, out 4. Again, she would have done this 100 times. Breathing is a rope across a river. She checks the litter locks. Spring pins bite, straps lie flat. The thermometer clicks under Lilo's tongue. The sphygmomanometer cuff squeaks as air escapes. Technical words become lullaby. Pulse steady, pressure acceptable. The air tastes of rubber and antiseptic. The world shrinks to the arc of a wristwatch hand. They pass a signboard hand-painted in 2 languages. PW Hospital, admissions. On the perimeter, a generator coughs and catches, throwing current to lamps that turn canvas into rooms and strangers into patients. German civilians sweep glass into tidy, embarrassed piles. A US captain with a clipboard looks like a carpenter who builds with names and numbers. Brenner, requisitioned physician, waits at the door, face bare of politics. He will help because doctors help. It's a relief to have a rule that old. Ellison would have preferred a better road. Henderson would have preferred clearer fields of fire. Neither gets what they want, but both have what they need, a system that does not ask them to improvise the universe every morning. The hospital footprint is startling. Wards, an admissions tent, a pharmacy smelling of alcohol and hope, a sterilizer tent ticking like a patient metronome. By the first week of June, officers will report that the US Third Army operates hundreds of hospitals in Germany alone, a number that would have sounded like boasting if it weren't typed on orders and mapped to lat-longs. The impossible part is how quickly it appears. Weeks, not seasons. The ambulance stops at a mark painted on mud. Henderson swings the doors wide, and they carry Lilo into light that feels cleaner than air. Somewhere a chaplain is writing a letter for a man who cannot hold a pen. Somewhere a cook is counting ladles to match rations to beds. Lilo hears only the sore edge of her own breath, then the softer sounds that mean safety. A cart's squeak, a nurse's shoes, the precise click of instruments nesting in enamel trays. The war, for one corridor's length, looks tidy. The next corridor will decide if it stays that way. The first thing Lilo notices is the temperature, not warm exactly, but controlled, as if the room had a will. Battery lamps gather the light and pour it onto enamel trays where instruments rest in tidy rows, forceps, clamps, a stethoscope that has outlived 3 stations. The bilingual sign above admissions says what it needs to say in as few words as possible. The handwriting is German school script, the authority American. Dr. Karl Brenner pulls on gloves, eyes calm but not cold, the look of a man who has remembered his first oath and intends to keep it. Ellison briefs the ward nurse with the economy of a radio report, hours since first pain, intervals, presentation uncertain, vitals stable. The German orderlies scrub as if the war were a stain they could get off with enough soap. Their armbands identify them as auxiliaries under US supervision. Their pay is ration tickets and the relief of purpose. Henderson loiters near the entrance, body angled to see both corridor and bed, his rifle muzzle down, safety on, finger nowhere near the trigger. It is a posture he learned from men who had learned to survive. Intake is its own liturgy. Dog tag numbers are copied. A tag is made for Lilo's wrist. Her name is spelled twice and verified once more by a nurse who has learned the hard way that names are fragile. An interpreter writes a phrase card for the bedside. Atmen, trinken, schieben, wenn wir sagen, breathe, drink, push, when we say. Brenner palpates with respectful hands and a small frown. He would have liked an X-ray he will not get, but skill was made for such moments. Ellison checks the oxygen bottle reading and then the backup, because a second bottle is a promise you make to the future. What makes the room feel impossible is not the number of people, but the number of procedures. Everything has a place and a label, and the labels have a way of turning panic into work. The sterilizer's clock face ticks towards safe. The generator hum comes up when a lamp flickers. The admission clerk flips a page as if turning down a bed. Ellison would have told her students back in training that fear is natural. It is also undisciplined. Lists discipline fear. She watches Lilo's eyes and sees a mind trying to balance 2 truths. Yesterday was ideology, today is skill. Brenner meets Ellison's glance and nods, a little bow that admits the chain of command without surrendering dignity. In that exchange there is the shape of the new world, a German doctor in an American ward, a patient in German uniform under a US lamp, and no one asking for anything but competence. Outside the window, a CCKW downshifts. Inside, the room takes a collective breath and holds it. The next decision will be pure medicine. Contractions tighten until they seem to stitch the seconds together, and the ward compresses around one problem. The presentation is wrong. Brenner's hands are steady as a tripod. Ellison's voice is the rope. In 2, out 4. The American obstetrician arrives with a portable lamp and a case that snaps open like a good book. The lamp's circle becomes a stage, and on it, the cast is simple. A patient, 2 physicians, a nurse, a future. Ellison would have preferred more time. Brenner would have preferred a quiet student to teach. The obstetrician would have preferred a teaching hospital in Boston. What he has is a ward in Bavaria with a mixed team that has already decided not to fail. He runs through options in a voice that erases rank. If we can't rotate, we pull. If we pull, we protect the head. Ellison repeats each instruction aloud, not because he needs the confirmation, but because the human mind steadies when it hears a plan named. The numbers keep pace with the prayers. Pulse 96, pressure 130/80, oxygen steady. Instruments count in and out, a ritual older than this war. Forceps 2, clamps 4, needles 3, sponges 8, now 7, now 8 again. Henderson guards the door and records times to the minute. Later a captain will read the log and understand more from those digits than any after-action flourish. Lilo's world is the lamplight and Ellison's face, the way the nurse keeps her eyes level and her words few. Brenner attempts the rotation maneuver carefully, a taut memory unrolling in his hands. When resistance says no, the obstetrician says yes to the other path and they move together, a choreography that would have fit anywhere. Bodies demand humility. They deliver with patience and exact pressure, speaking as little as possible, listening more than men in war usually do. The ward's noises fade until even the generator seems to hold its breath. Ellison feels the familiar sweat between shoulder blades that means the body is doing work it never advertises. The room expands again at the first cry, a wet, indignant sound that releases half a dozen lungs in the same beat. Ellison wraps the infant fast and checks the colour, the breathing, the tone, the tiny fists. Brenner closes his eyes for the length of a blink, and in that quiet his past sits down. What rises when he opens them is simply a doctor. Lilo whispers a name that would have caused trouble last week and causes only relief now. The obstetrician nods once, small and professional, and snaps his case shut. The next sound is the click of a pen as Henderson finishes the line that turns a miracle into a record. Morning thins the ward's lamplight to an honest grey. Coffee steam hangs in the admissions tent where numbers and names braid into cents. Ellison signs the supply ledger with the same neat hand she uses on a chart. 1 plasma unit consumed, 1 ether ampule broken, linen count reset, forceps accounted for, cord clamps restocked. Henderson files his timings, every minute accounted for from gate whistle to first cry. The ink looks ordinary and is anything but the bureaucratic handwriting of victory. If you follow those carbon copies outward, you find the machine they feed. A requisition travels with a convoy, rides a ferry of trucks across the river, then stacks in a depot where men sort by the clock. A GMC CCKW is rated for 2.5 tons and used for more when the road is good. Tyre pressure is adjusted for mud. Straps are checked by habit learned the hard way. Somewhere a motor pool schedules preventative maintenance that never makes a headline, and because of it a generator coughs to life when a labour turns at midnight and needs light. The chain is dull until you need it. Then it is beautiful. The numbers would have sounded impossible to anyone who had not watched them arrive. The United States built roughly 296,000 aircraft, nearly 49,000 M4 Shermans, and 2,710 Liberty ships. At Willow Run, a B-24 Liberator rolled off the line roughly every hour at peak. Those are not metaphors. They are calendars and clocks turned into metal. On paper, such abundance seems far from a maternity cot. In practice, it means the ward has spare bulbs, a second oxygen bottle, clean sheets waiting 2 beds ahead, and the confidence to transfer a breech instead of gambling in a tent. Doctrine writes the rule, industry pays the bill. Brenner drafts a note recommending a permanent liaison with local midwives under US oversight, a practical concession to language and trust. An American major initials it without ceremony. Policy in this place is a door you oil and walk through. Lilo, propped up, tastes the square of chocolate Ellison pressed into her hand hours earlier and discovers sweetness she had forgotten existed. She would have cried if she were not so thirsty. The interpreter writes down phrases for later mothers. Pain now, help now, safe now. Such sentences rebuild a world faster than speeches. Outside, a convoy turns over and settles into that patient diesel thrum that sounds like a city breathing. Henderson stacks the logs in a binder a clerk will carry to a headquarters where someone will add it to a table that shows admissions trending down as sanitation and nutrition trend up. The conclusions are not poetic. They do not need to be. Inside Lilo's door, the baby sleeps. Outside, a truck driver leans on the wheel and laughs at a joke he will not remember. Between them runs a chain of custody for mercy that only an industrial democracy could afford, and that here it pays without hesitation. For a long breath, the room is only hands and intention, the lamp a small sun fixed over a narrow world. Lilo rides the crest of pain with her eyes on Ellison's face, steady as a horizon. Brenner's fingers are exact without being hurried, the American obstetrician offering soft directions with the confidence of a man who has done this on 3 continents in 1 war. Henderson at the door writes minute marks that will outlast memory, when the lamp was raised, when the manoeuvre began, when the room went so quiet even the generator seemed to listen. The child arrives in a sudden, generous rush, an angry wet cry that shivers the dust in the lamp's reflector. It is not triumph the ward feels first, it is relief, and then the smaller private victories of routine reclaiming the space. Ellison wraps the infant, checks colour, respiration, tone. Brenner confirms the cord clamp and nods, an old apprenticeship briefly restored. Lilo tries a name out loud and hears it land without consequence. What would have brought suspicion last week brings only a nurse's smile now. Outside the windows, a CCKW downshifts on the hospital perimeter. Inside, the infant's breathing sets a gentler metronome than any clock. Ellison records supplies used with the same neat hand she used to sign the transfer. 1 plasma unit, 1 ether ampule, 4 clamps. Henderson notes that the weapon at his shoulder did not need to speak for order to hold. None of this would feel surprising to the Americans. They are trained for days like this. But to Lilo, the consistency is the shock. She had been taught to expect the random appetite of victors. Instead, she finds a system that does not change its manners when no one is watching. The obstetrician snaps his case shut and lets the silence soak. "Good," Ellison says, English first, then in German the interpreter supplies. It is a small word with an industrial backing. Factories, rails, docks, depots, all arriving in this room as linen and light. The nurse tucks the blanket with ceremonial care. Henderson lowers his pencil and draws a line across the page to mark the end of the entry. The line is not just for today. It points forward into the part of peace that must be manufactured, box by box, bed by bed, because mercy at scale is work. Morning puts the ward into honest colours, the green-grey of blankets, the tin shine of the instrument tray, the brown coffee in chipped mugs that smell faintly of soap. In the admissions tent, the clerks begin their quiet campaign against chaos. Carbon copies line up like platoons. A rubber stamp gives each page the same small badge of authority. Pencils are sharpened with pocket knives polished by 1,000 turns. Ellison inventories the night as if it were a field, walking the rows with her clipboard. Linen counts reconcile, forceps accounted for, ether replaced from a locked cabinet whose key lives on a chain at her waist. Henderson delivers his timings, precise down to the minute. He has learned that if you can count a thing, you can improve it, and if you can improve it, you will save an MP from a fistfight or a private from a fever later. Follow the papers outward, and the hospital becomes a node in something larger. Requisitions ride CCKWS to a depot where cranes lift pallets marked dressings and syringes. Mechanics change out a generator's brushes before they fail. Cooks log ration issue by bed, not by guess. The detail work does not feel like glory, but men who have survived know glory is a finicky god and logistics is faithful. Numbers arrive that sound like exaggeration until you stand among them. By early June, reports will show 3rd US Army operating hundreds of hospitals in Germany, many designated for POWs. It is not that Americans love paperwork. It is that paperwork lets an ethical promise become a physical fact. Brenner drafts a practical note recommending a bilingual midwife roster, an American major initials without fuss. Lilo dozes, the infant sighing in that quick, light way new lungs learn. Somewhere across the compound, a chaplain conducts a graveside service measured and merciful. Somewhere else, a vaccination line moves, sleeves rolled, the needle flashing like a spear that kills invisible enemies. Ellison pauses at the tent flap and watches a convoy turn onto the road, canvas tops snapping in the mid-morning wind. Liberty ships steaming at sea mean dressings on these shelves. Aircraft plants mean spare bulbs for this lamp. Tank factories mean the MPs can afford to sling their weapons muzzle down. The arithmetic is unromantic and irrefutable. Abundance here prevents catastrophe there. She signs the ledger, closes it with that satisfying thock, and feels the day shift from crisis back to schedule, which is victory by another name. By week's end, dates written in 3 hands on the ward board, the exception becomes procedure. A German midwife is added to rotation under US oversight, her name chalked between Ellison's and a corporal's, phrase cards multiply at bedsides in sharp school script. The admissions tent gains a second table because someone noticed the afternoon queue turned brittle when waiting times stretched past 10 minutes. The changes are small, almost homey, and precisely the point. War taught the Americans that big victories are built from repeatable motions. Here they flip a switch they have flipped in North Africa and Italy. Sanitation standards posted and enforced, ration scales set by weight not whim, inoculations scheduled by serial number, not by the loudness of complaint. What feels like kindness to the patients is discipline to the staff, and discipline properly applied feels like relief. Brenner writes operating notes that a sergeant translates into a typed sheet, the major signs, not because it is perfect, but because a signed imperfect plan beats a clever talk with no signature. Lilo, mobile now, volunteers to interpret, discovering that language itself can be a supply line. She would have never imagined standing between an American nurse and a German mother, smoothing fear into reason with verbs. Henderson notices something he will not put into words for years. Incident reports trend down when rumours trend toward truth. When prisoners learn that the rules will be kept, they stop rehearsing for betrayal and start cooperating to make the day go faster. The impossible measure hides in plain sight. At Willow Run in Michigan, a B-24 Liberator rolled off the line roughly every hour at peak. The same mentality is visible here in miniature: throughput, checks, predictable results. In early June, Third Army's footprint includes on the order of 200-plus hospitals in Germany. No one in the tent can name the exact figure offhand, but everyone feels the mass under their boots. The contrast writes itself. On the German side of the wire, there had been boiled bandages and a ration card that bought air. On this side, replacement bulbs sit in a labelled bin, and someone oils the door hinge before it squeals. This is how cruelty is starved, not by speeches but by supplies arriving on time. When a rain squall combs the compound, shutters drop and tarps go up with rehearsed efficiency. The ward light barely flickers. A nurse laughs once at a private joke about generators, then returns to work. The day's last entry notes 3 discharges and 0 incidents. In a war famous for noise, the decisive weapon here is the quiet click of a latch that always catches. Step back from the cot and the ledger, and the hospital resolves into an equation whose variables were solved years earlier in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and on the West Coast. The numbers are stubborn facts. Roughly 296,000 American aircraft produced across the war years. About 49,000 M4 Sherman tanks, 2,710 Liberty ships, with mid-war yards averaging around 42 days per hull. They are the kind of figures that look like boasting until you meet their footprints, wharves with no room left for surprise, railheads that hum all night, highways polished to a dull shine by the soles of boots. Those statistics do not hover in the abstract over this Bavarian ward. They arrive as small guarantees. An aircraft plant's rhythm becomes a crate of spare bulbs that keeps a lamp from failing in the 1 minute it cannot. A shipyard's tempo becomes pallets of dressings that let Ellison change linen without gambling on shortages. A tank factory's depth becomes MPs who can stand at ease, weapons slung, because a strategic reserve exists somewhere behind them, and men who feel secure are disinclined to cruelty. None of this excuses the terrible arithmetic of combat. It contextualizes it. The United States learned to translate moral intention into material pattern. Geneva's text demanded medical attention according to need and regard for women. Industry gave those sentences weight. Brenner, walking between wards, recognizes the component pieces he had once lacked. Reliable oxygen bottles, sterilizers cycling on schedule, soap that does not run out, a drain that stays unclogged because some corporal assigned a man to check it, and the man was given 10 minutes in a day that had those minutes to spare. Lilo, now sitting up with her child asleep against her chest, sees a different calculus. The enemy she had been trained to fear becomes predictable in a way that makes fear unnecessary. Henderson flips through incident reports and sees most of them ending with phrases like resolved per policy instead of escalated. Ellison closes a cabinet and hears the click of a latch that once would have sounded like nothing, now sounds like a line of defence. The math is not romantic. It is decency multiplied by scale, redundancy added to compassion, error margins narrowed by habit, until what could have been a tragedy becomes a long, unremarkable morning. America wins here not because it is perfect, but because it is organised to keep promises even when no one is applauding. The handbook that rode in Ellison's breast pocket since training was never meant to be literature, but its clauses move like a plot when given resources. Separation of female prisoners, provision of medical care required by condition, standards of sanitation. There is no romance in the phrases until you watch them prevent harm. A week after the birth, a camp rumour tangles the lines. Some prisoners whisper that medical transfers mean disappearance. Henderson, who has learned to treat rumours like unexploded ordnance, answers with process. He has the interpreter read the policy aloud at roll call, then posts the transport schedule where it can be checked against the clock. Trucks arrive when the board says they will. Patients return with visible dressings and paperwork under a rubber band. The rumour dies of dehydration. Brenner, who used to practice medicine under a different book, finds himself trusting the predictability more than he trusts the men who enforce it. That is the genius of doctrine married to supply. It teaches people to believe in the day's shape. Lilo, now helping other women through intake, encounters a young signals auxiliary pinched by fear. "Breathe in 2, out 4, she says, hearing Ellison in her own mouth, and feels a hinge swing inside her. In the tents, the dull work of prevention continues. Lice checks, vaccinations, soap issue, latrine standards. This is not the stuff of medals, but anyone who has survived a campaign knows the enemy you do not see is the one that kills you slowest. Ellison notices the incident log tilt even farther toward routine. Fewer fights at chow lines, fewer refusals at sick call, fewer panicked attempts to bolt at the sight of an ambulance. None of this would move a general's flag on a wall map, but taken together, it shortens the war's long tail. Men rotate home sooner when zones stabilise, trains run on schedule when epidemics do not bloom, surrenders proceed without last-ditch shootings when prisoners expect the rules to hold. The arc bends not by eloquence, but by checklists. A field sterilizer cycles, a generator's maintenance sheet receives another initial, a corporal replaces a worn hinge before it squeals. Doctrine has become habit, habit has become culture, culture has become the thing that feels like destiny when you are lucky enough to live inside it. On her last morning in the ward, Ellison folds the blanket at the foot of Lilo's bed with the same care she used on the first night. Edges aligned, corners sharp, respect disguised as tidiness. The baby's breath is quick and even, the colour good, the weight the right heaviness for a nurse's arm. Henderson appears in the doorway with the discharge forms. He is going stateside soon, rumour says, and the idea sits on his shoulders like a pack he has not decided to shrug off yet. Brenner signs his name in a hand steadier than the first day. He will stay when the Americans draw down, because the work will remain even when the flags change. Lilo reads the stamped lines that say what no speech could. Admitted on this date, transferred under these orders, delivered under that lamp, discharged to this enclosure in stable condition. The words are dry. Dry is how you keep promises long enough for people to believe them. Step outside and the hospital's soundscape plays its plain symphony, a generator's basso hum, a CCKW's gear whine, the small tap of a clerk's stamp, a kettle lid rattling on a mess line. Somewhere a chaplain murmurs over a grave. Somewhere a mechanic wipes his hands, satisfied that the belt will not slip today. If you zoom the map outward, the music keeps time with a nation. Roughly 2,710 Liberty ships built, each one a corridor down which rations and bandages could sail, about 49,000 Shermans forged, enough steel confidence to keep rifles slung muzzle down, nearly 300,000 aircraft turned out, the echo of which is spare bulbs in a Bavarian ward. At Willow Run, a B-24 roughly every hour at peak, an impossible tempo that makes sense only when you stand in a room where a second oxygen bottle waits because someone funded redundancy. None of this argues that victory was clean. It argues that American power made a habit of turning ethics into equipment and schedules into shelter. Ellison signs her last supply report and tucks the pencil behind her ear. Henderson checks the hinge he oiled yesterday and smiles when it does not squeal. Brenner looks at the window light and thinks it will be enough. Lilo whispers, "Danke," that carries the weight of a truce and the beginning of a world. The convoy downshifts on the road outside. The ledger line dries. The wire hums in the wind and does not cut.